Good day, everyone. I hope you're having a warm and peaceful day. Today we'll explore a deeply emotional story about Ly Tu Diep and little Ly, when a few careless words from the outside world leave a quiet wound inside a fragile family. As James tries to protect the child he loves, he learns the hard way that strength isn't always loud, and love isn't proven by confrontation, but by calm presence and understanding. Stay with us to see how a family without perfect labels finds the courage to stand together, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter of their journey. The afternoon was quiet in the bamboo forest, the kind of quiet that usually made the wooden house feel safe and whole. Little Ly came home from school earlier than usual. She took off her shoes carefully, lining them up by the door the way Tu Diep had taught her. James noticed it right away. Normally, Ly would call out, laugh, or rush inside with stories that spilled over each other. Today, she said nothing. James was fixing a loose plank near the window. He looked up, smiled, and asked how school was. Ly nodded once and walked past him. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, as if her backpack weighed more than it should. Tu Diep, standing at the small kitchen table, felt something tighten in her chest. She watched Ly place her bag down and sit quietly, staring at her hands. No one pushed. Dinner was simple. The sound of chopsticks touching bowls filled the space between them. Ly ate slowly. Halfway through the meal, she stopped and whispered that she was full. She carried her bowl to the sink, careful not to meet James's eyes. When she thought no one was looking, she slipped a folded piece of paper into the trash. Later, Tu Diep took the trash out. She froze when she saw the corner of a crumpled drawing. She unfolded it slowly. It was a picture of 3 people standing in front of the wooden house, drawn with bright, uneven lines. James recognized himself immediately, taller, smiling. Tu Diep stood beside him, and Ly, holding both their hands. Across the top, in crooked letters, were the words, "My family." A dark line had been scratched through the picture, hard enough to tear the paper. That night, the forest was still. James sat on the floor, sanding a small wooden toy he had promised Ly. Tu Diep tucked Ly into bed and kissed her forehead. Just as she turned to leave, Ly's voice stopped her. "Mom?" she asked softly, "is our family missing someone?" Tu Diep felt the question land like a stone in water, sending ripples she could not see the end of. She sat back down beside the bed. She asked where the question came from, keeping her voice calm. Ly hesitated, then stared at the blanket. "A kid at school said our family isn't real," Ly said. "They said I don't have a real dad. They said James is just someone who stays with us." The words were simple, but they cut deep. Ly did not cry. That frightened Tu Diep more than tears would have. She brushed Ly's hair back and told her that families come in many forms, that love mattered more than titles. Ly listened, but her eyes stayed distant. James heard none of this. He was still in the main room when Tu Diep came out. One look at her face told him something was wrong. She explained what had happened, repeating the words carefully. James felt heat rise in his chest, sharp and fast. "They had no right," he said. "No one gets to say that to her." He did not sleep much that night. Images kept replaying in his mind. Ly standing alone, Ly feeling ashamed, Ly wondering whether she belonged. By morning, his worry had hardened into something else, determination. If the world questioned their family, he would answer it. He did not tell Tu Diep his plan. After breakfast, he said he needed to go into town. He drove straight to the school. The building looked harmless in the sunlight, children's laughter echoing across the yard. It made his anger feel almost out of place, but it did not fade. James asked to speak to a teacher. Words poured out faster than he intended. He explained what had been said, how it had hurt a child. He demanded that something be done. The teacher listened, polite but guarded. When James insisted on meeting the other child's parents, the teacher hesitated. Eventually, he was ushered into a small office. Another adult joined them. James repeated his story again, his voice louder now. The other parent crossed their arms and frowned. "Kids say things," the parent said. "It's not our fault if your situation confuses them." The word situation burned. James tried to explain, to defend, to make them understand that love made a family real. But the room felt closed, the air heavy. The teacher suggested keeping personal matters separate from school. Someone mentioned boundaries. Someone mentioned not escalating things. James realized slowly and painfully that he was losing. His words, driven by emotion, were being dismissed as overreaction. When he finally left the office, his hands were shaking. He had come to protect Ly. Instead, he felt smaller than when he arrived. He drove home in silence. The bamboo forest greeted him as always, unchanged, indifferent. Inside the wooden house, Tu Diep was waiting. She could tell immediately where he had been. "You went to the school?" she said. James nodded. He tried to explain, but his voice broke halfway through. He admitted that he had failed, that nothing had changed, that he might have made things worse. He waited for blame. Tu Diep did not raise her voice. She listened until he finished, then sat down across from him. "You wanted to protect her," she said. "That part was never wrong." James looked at his hands. "Then why does it feel like I made everything worse?" Tu Diep took a deep breath. "Because protection isn't about fighting everyone outside. Sometimes it's about teaching a child not to be ashamed of what's inside." James did not answer. He did not know how to respond. That night, he sat beside Ly as she fell asleep. He watched her chest rise and fall. For the first time since he met her, he felt a fear he could not easily name. Not of losing an argument, not of being judged, but of losing his place in the family he loved, not because he left, but because he did not know how to stay the right way. James lay awake long after the house grew quiet. The wooden beams above him creaked softly, familiar sounds that usually brought comfort. Tonight, they only reminded him how fragile everything felt. He thought about the way Ly had looked at him earlier, searching his face for reassurance he had not known how to give. He had always believed that being present was enough, that staying meant protecting. Now he wondered if presence without understanding could still leave wounds. Near dawn, he rose and stepped outside. Mist curled between the bamboo stalks, wrapping the house in pale silence. James rested his hand against the wooden wall, grounding himself. He remembered his own childhood, the sharp edges of words spoken by adults who thought children would forget. He had not forgotten, neither would Ly. Inside, Tu Diep watched him through the window. She did not interrupt. She understood that this was something James needed to face alone first. When he finally came back in, his eyes were tired but clearer. He did not have answers yet. But for the first time since yesterday, he knew one thing for certain. If he wanted to protect this family, he would have to learn a different kind of strength. One that did not push forward blindly, but stood firm without striking back. That lesson, he sensed, was only beginning. The morning light slowly filled the room. Ly stirred in her sleep, murmuring something James could not hear. He sat nearby, promising himself that he would listen better, act slower, and learn how to shield her heart without teaching her fear. Whatever came next, he would face it differently. This was not the end, just first lesson. The next few days passed quietly, but the tension never fully lifted. Little Ly went to school each morning without complaint, yet something in her had shifted. She still smiled, still hugged James before leaving, but her laughter came less easily. James noticed the way she hesitated before mentioning her classmates, the way her drawings had changed. The wooden house was still filled with warmth, yet there was a thin crack running through it, invisible but felt. James tried to fix that crack the only way he knew how at first. He became overly attentive. He asked too many questions. He hovered when Ly did her homework. One evening, she finally looked up at him and asked, very gently, "Did I do something wrong?" The question hit harder than any confrontation at the school. James froze. He realized that his fear, however well-intentioned, was starting to reach her. He knelt in front of her and shook his head quickly, telling her she had done nothing wrong. Ly nodded, but the doubt lingered in her eyes. That night, after Ly had gone to bed, Tu Diep spoke. She did not accuse him. She did not lecture. She simply said, "You're trying to carry all of this by yourself." James exhaled slowly. "If I don't, who will?" Tu Diep looked at him for a long moment. "We will," she said, "together, but not the way you tried before." The following morning, Tu Diep asked for time off from her work. She prepared carefully, choosing her words the same way she chose her actions, with intention. She told James she would go to the school. He stiffened immediately, old frustration rising. "They won't listen," he said. "They might," Tu Diep replied. "But even if they don't, that's not the only reason I'm going." At the school, Tu Diep's presence was different from James's. She did not lead with anger or demand understanding. She asked to speak privately with the teacher. She described what Ly had experienced, not as an accusation, but as a concern. She spoke about children, about how words settle deep and shape how they see themselves. She did not ask for punishment, she asked for awareness. The teacher listened more closely this time. Perhaps it was the calm tone, or the way Tu Diep framed the issue not as a conflict, but as a shared responsibility. They agreed to address the class gently, to talk about families, about differences, about kindness. Later that day, Tu Diep also spoke to Ly's teacher alone. She asked for help in creating a space where no child would feel lesser for the shape of their home. The conversation was quiet, respectful, and effective in ways James's confrontation had not been. When Tu Diep returned home, James was waiting. He did not interrupt as she told him what had happened. He listened, truly listened, and for the first time since this began, he felt something loosen inside his chest. That evening, Tu Diep sat with Ly on the floor. She brought out colored pencils and blank paper. "Let's draw," she suggested. Ly hesitated, then nodded. They drew together in silence for a while. Then Tu Diep asked Ly to draw her family again, any way she wanted. Ly picked up a green pencil and drew the bamboo forest first, then the wooden house, then herself. She paused before adding the others. "You don't have to rush," Tu Diep said. Slowly, Ly drew Tu Diep beside her. Then she looked at James, who was watching from across the room. "Can I draw you too?" she asked. James swallowed. "Of course." Ly drew him standing close, his hand resting on her shoulder. When she finished, she smiled faintly. "This feels right," she said. Tu Diep nodded. "Because it is." A few days later, Ly came home from school with a different energy. She talked about a class discussion where everyone shared stories about their families. Some had one parent, some lived with grandparents, some had parents who worked far away. The teacher had said there was no single way for a family to look. "One kid said my family sounded nice," Ly added casually. James turned away for a moment, pretending to busy himself so Ly would not see the emotion on his face. That night, James sat outside the wooden house, watching the bamboo sway gently. Tu Diep joined him. He spoke quietly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace they had rebuilt. "I thought being strong meant fighting back," he said. "I thought if I didn't, I was failing her." Tu Diep shook her head slightly. "Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's choosing not to pass your fear on. James nodded. I was afraid, he admitted. Not just for her, for me. I was scared that if the world didn't see me as her family, one day she wouldn't either. Tu Diep reached for his hand. Family isn't decided by the world, she said. It's built by what we do every day. James held on to that thought. He began to change, subtly but steadily. He learned when to step forward and when to step back. He learned to ask Ni how she felt instead of assuming. He learned that protecting her did not mean shielding her from every harsh word, but teaching her that those words did not define her. One afternoon, James and Ly worked together on a new wooden toy. As they sanded and shaped it, Ly said, I told my friend you're my family. James paused. You did? Ly nodded. I said families are people who stay. James smiled, a quiet, steady smile. In that moment, his fear eased, not because the world had changed, but because something within them had. As the seasons shifted, the wooden house remained, standing firm among the bamboo. It had weathered storms before. It would weather more. But inside it now lived a deeper understanding. Love did not need to prove itself loudly. It only needed to endure. James no longer feared losing his place. He had learned that belonging was not something he had to defend with force. It was something he earned every day by listening, by staying, and by letting calm be his strength. After a hurtful comment at school makes little Ly question whether her family is real, a crack forms inside the wooden house in the bamboo forest. James reacts with anger, confronting the school and failing, leaving him shaken and afraid of losing his place in the family he loves. His attempt to protect only deepens the wound, revealing that presence without understanding can still cause pain. Tu Diep responds differently, choosing calm over confrontation. She speaks gently with the school, helps Ly reclaim her sense of belonging, and shows James that true protection is not about winning arguments, but about teaching a child not to feel ashamed. Through patience, listening, and love, James learns strength. The family does not change the world, but they rebuild certainty together, discovering that family is defined by who stays, understands, and grows together slowly.